Tonight, we're going to talk about a land where three great faiths lived side by side for the better part of 800 years, where poets and philosophers walked the same marble streets as sultans and saints, and where a civilization rose in the far west of the medieval world that shone so brightly, its light reached across all of Europe and beyond. We travel now to the sunlit hills and quiet orange groves of the Iberian Peninsula, to a place the Arabs would come to call Al-Andalus, and to the long, strange, magnificent story of Muslim Spain, from the ships that first crossed a narrow strait in the year 711, to the tears of a last king weeping as he rode away from his fallen city almost 800 years later. If you find some comfort here tonight, take a slow moment to like this video and to subscribe if you would like to keep drifting off to sleep with more stories like this one. It genuinely helps this quiet little corner grow. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other sleepless souls around the world know that they are not awake alone, and that someone else, somewhere far away, is listening to the very same soft story tonight. So settle in now. Loosen your shoulders. Let your breath grow slow and even, and let the worries of the day drift somewhere far behind you. You are about to sink gently into the long story of Al-Andalus, its rising, its splendor, and its slow and quiet fading. There is nothing you need to do for the next little while but rest and listen. Let us begin, as all long journeys begin, with the land itself. The Iberian Peninsula sits at the southwestern corner of Europe, a great squarish tongue of rock and earth reaching down toward the coast of Africa. It is bordered on almost every side by water, the Atlantic Ocean stretching along its west and its north, the Mediterranean Sea washing its long eastern shore, and to the south, the narrow blue channel of the Strait of Gibraltar, where at its tightest point, only about 9 miles of open water separate Europe from the African coast. On a clear day, a person standing on either shore can see the other. Mountains rising in the distance across the water, close enough to feel almost like a neighbor, and yet another world altogether. It helps, before we go any further, to picture the place itself. The interior of the peninsula is a vast high plateau called the Meseta, dry and windswept, burning under the summer sun and freezing under the winter winds. Great mountain ranges cross the land like the ribs of some sleeping giant, the Pyrenees walling it off from France in the north, the Sierra Nevada rising snow-capped in the far south, and the Cantabrian Mountains standing along the northern coast. Between the mountains run long river valleys, the wide, slow Guadalquivir in the south, the Ebro sweeping east toward the Mediterranean, the Tagus and the Douro flowing west toward the Atlantic. Along these rivers lay the richest farmland, gardens of olive and fig and vine, fields of wheat and barley, orchards of pomegranate and almond, all warmed by a sun that lingered long into the year. The southern coast, softened by African winds and cooled by the Mediterranean, was gentle and generous, a country of vineyards and orchards and quiet fishing towns. The center was harder, high and dry, a land of stone and shepherds and small walled cities. The north was greener and wilder, a country of misty forests and steep hills, closer in feel to Ireland or Wales than to the sun-baked south. All of it, from the rocky Atlantic cliffs to the palm-fringed Mediterranean beaches, made up a single peninsula, but a peninsula divided within itself by its mountains and its climates, so that no one people had ever quite ruled it easily as a single whole. Long before the story we are about to tell, this land had been the home of many peoples. Ancient tribes of Iberians and Celts had lived there. Phoenician traders had built small colonies along its southern coasts, and the sailors of Carthage had come and gone. Greeks had planted their own towns along the Mediterranean shore. And for 600 years, from the days of the great generals to the fall of the Western Empire, it had been a wealthy and cherished province of Rome, called Hispania, its cities laced with aqueducts and paved with stone, its farms sending grain and olive oil across the sea to feed the capital far away. When Rome at last fell in the west, its long peace ended, and waves of Germanic peoples poured across the old frontiers. And into Hispania came a tribe called the Visigoths, who by the closing years of the 5th century had taken the land for themselves and made it their kingdom. In the years we are speaking of, the closing decades of the 7th century, the Visigothic kingdom had held the peninsula for more than 200 years, ruling from a capital at Toledo, high on a rocky hill above a bend of the river Tagus. The Visigoths themselves were only a small warrior aristocracy, no more than a few percent of the population, ruling over a much larger mass of Hispano-Romans, the descendants of the Latin-speaking Christians of Roman times. Above the ordinary people rose a class of Visigothic nobles, proud and warlike, and above them all sat their king, elected in theory by the nobles from among themselves, and holding court in the stone halls of Toledo. It was a kingdom that had once seemed strong, but by these years its strength was mostly a memory. For the Visigothic kingdom was, by this time, deeply troubled, and the trouble ran through it from top to bottom. The nobles were fractious and greedy, and they treated the throne as a prize to be fought over rather than an office to be respected. Kings were made and unmade, murdered and deposed, in an endless cycle of plots and civil wars, so that a man might rule for a year, or a season, or scarcely a month before some faction gathered against him. The taxes pressed down heavily upon the ordinary farmers, who had little love for their masters. The great community of Jews who had lived on the peninsula since Roman times had been persecuted with increasing cruelty in the decades before, forced into baptism, stripped of property, threatened with slavery, so that they too had every reason to look upon the ruling order with quiet loathing. And the church, though officially the partner of the crown, was itself full of quarrels and worldly bishops who cared as much for their own lands as for the souls of the flock. Life for the common people went on beneath this troubled surface in its old slow rhythm. Farmers worked the same fields their grandfathers had worked, growing wheat and grapes and olives, raising sheep and pigs, paying their taxes and their tithes, going to the same stone churches to be married and to be buried. In the cities, artisans still made pots and weapons and cloth, though on a smaller scale than in Roman times, and the great aqueducts and bathhouses of the old empire stood half-ruined, their stones sometimes carried away to build newer, plainer things. The roads that Rome had built still ran straight across the land, but they were less traveled now and less well kept, and the traveler on them met fewer merchants and more brigands than in the old days. It was a world grown a little smaller and a little poorer than it had been, waiting perhaps for something to shake it out of its long, slow decline. Then, in the very last years of the 7th century, that shaking came from an unexpected quarter, though the Visigoths, absorbed in their own quarrels, had barely noticed it happening. Far to the east, in the deserts of Arabia, an astonishing new movement had risen in the space of a single lifetime. A prophet in the city of Mecca had preached a new faith, submission to the one God, called Islam. And within 100 years of his passing, the followers of that faith had burst out of Arabia and swept across a great arc of the world with a speed that had no equal in history. They had taken the ancient lands of Persia and toppled its old empire. They had wrested Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land from the Byzantines. They had pressed westward along the whole southern shore of the Mediterranean, across Libya and what we now call Tunisia, and into the mountains of Morocco, and by the closing years of the 7th century, their armies stood upon the African coast, gazing across the narrow strait toward the wooded hills of Hispania. The people who had done this work were a mixed host. Arabs from the deserts of the east who had begun it all, and alongside them now the Berbers, the fierce mountain peoples of North Africa, who had themselves been conquered only a short while before, and had then taken up the new faith with tremendous energy and joined the great expansion outward. Together they formed the armies of the Caliphate, an empire that stretched, in these years, from the borders of India in the east to the very edge of Africa in the west, ruled from a distant capital in Damascus by a family called the Umayyads. In the far western provinces of that empire, ambitious governors and generals looked hungrily northward across the strait, dreaming of new conquests, new plunder, new lands to add to the growing world of Islam. All they needed was an opportunity, a crack in the Visigothic order that would give them a reason and a way to cross. And that crack, when it came, would open from within. For in the year 710, the Visigothic king Witiza died, and instead of the crown passing peacefully, a fierce dispute broke out among the nobles. A powerful figure named Roderick seized the throne, but the sons and supporters of the dead king refused to accept him, and a bitter faction formed against the new ruler. According to the old accounts, some of these enemies of Roderick, seeing that they could not defeat him from within, made the fateful decision to reach out across the water for help. They would invite the Muslims to send a force across the strait, hoping to use them against their rival, never dreaming what such an invitation would truly unleash. All the pieces were quietly falling into place. A rich and beautiful land divided against itself, a persecuted people longing for change, a warlike new civilization gathered on the far side of a narrow strip of water, and now an open invitation from within to come and settle a quarrel. It needed only the first bold crossing, the first small army to test whether the door truly stood open. And in the spring of the year 711, that crossing would come. Rest here a moment, in the calm before it all begins. The Visigothic banners still fly over the towers of Toledo. The peasants still work their fields beneath a warm southern sun. The ships lie waiting on the African shore, oars ready, sails ready. And across 9 miles of blue water, a whole new world is about to begin. The man chosen to lead that first crossing was a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad, a general in the service of the governor of North Africa, and a soldier of great skill and greater ambition. In the spring of the year 711, he gathered a small force, perhaps 7,000 men, most of them Berbers like himself, with a scattering of Arabs among them, and he prepared his ships upon the African shore. His orders, as the old accounts have it, were cautious ones, to cross over, to test the ground, to raid perhaps, and to see whether the rumors of a divided and weakened kingdom were true. Whether he intended from the first to do more than that, or whether events simply carried him further than anyone had planned, no one can now say with certainty. But cross he did, and what he began upon that shore would not be undone for 800 years. The ship slipped across the narrow strait in the calm of a Mediterranean spring, and Tariq landed his army beneath a great rock that rose from the sea at the southern tip of the peninsula, a limestone mountain that had stood there since long before any human eye had looked upon it. From that day forward it would bear his name, for the Arabs called it Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, and the tongues of later ages would smooth those syllables down until the name we still use for it emerged, Gibraltar. There is a famous story, almost certainly a later legend but too fine to leave out, that upon landing Tariq ordered his ships to be burned, so that his men would know there was no going back, and would fight all the harder for having no way to retreat. Whether he truly did such a thing or not, the tale captures the audacity of the moment, a small force landing upon a strange coast, with a whole kingdom stretching away before them, and only their own courage to carry them forward. King Roderick, when word of the landing reached him, was far in the north, campaigning against rebellious tribes in the mountains, and he had to gather his forces and march the long, weary distance south to meet this new threat. He came with a great host, drawn from all his nobles and their followers, an army that on paper should have been more than enough to crush a raiding party such as Tariq's. But the Visigothic kingdom was rotten within, and the very nobles who marched with the king had every reason to want him dead. Some of them, it is said, were the very partisans of the dead King Witiza who had invited the Muslims across in the first place, and they had come to the battle not to defend Roderick, but to betray him. In the summer of 711, the two armies met beside a river in the far south of the peninsula, at a place remembered by the name of the Guadalete, and there, in a single tremendous day of fighting, the Visigothic kingdom came apart. The battle began in the ordinary way of that age, with the two armies drawn up in long lines and coming together in a great crash of shields and spears. Roderick held the centre with his household troops, and the wings were given to the sons and followers of his rivals. But as the fighting wore on and the day grew hot, the wings of Roderick's own army suddenly turned upon him, or perhaps simply melted away and rode off the field, leaving the king exposed in the middle with only a shrinking core of loyal men. The Muslim force, seeing this, pressed hard upon the collapsing centre, and by the end of the day the Visigothic army had been shattered utterly. Roderick himself vanished from history in that fight. His body was never certainly identified, and the old chronicles say only that he perished, or that his horse was found riderless at the river's edge, its saddle empty and its trappings glittering with gold. The last king of the Goths simply disappeared, swallowed by the dust and the confusion, and with him disappeared the kingdom he had ruled for scarcely a year. What happened next is one of the most astonishing collapses in all of medieval history. Tariq, having won his great victory, did not turn back. He pressed on into the heart of the peninsula with a speed and a boldness that seem hardly credible even now. The Visigothic kingdom, its king dead, its army destroyed, its nobles fled or scattered, could offer almost no coordinated resistance. City after city opened its gates. Some surrendered without a fight, welcoming the newcomers, or at least deciding that surrender on terms was better than a siege they could not win. The Jews of the peninsula, so long persecuted by their Christian masters, often greeted the Muslims as liberators and helped them to hold the cities they took. Peasants, weary of their old lords, showed little enthusiasm for fighting on behalf of a nobility that had done nothing for them. And the Muslims, for their part, showed a shrewdness that made the collapse even swifter. They came offering terms. Christians and Jews, as fellow peoples of the book, could keep their faith, keep their laws, keep their churches and synagogues, keep their property, so long as they paid a special tax and accepted the authority of the new rulers. It was a bargain that many across the peninsula were more than willing to strike. Tariq drove north with his small army, and behind him came a second, larger force led by his overlord, the governor of North Africa himself, an Arab noble named Musa ibn Nusayr, who had crossed the strait when he saw how easily his subordinate was carving up the country, and who wanted a share of the glory before it was all gone. There is a famous tale, again probably embellished, but telling for what it reveals, that when Musa at last caught up with Tariq in the middle of the peninsula, he was so jealous of the younger man's successes that he struck him across the face with a whip and had him briefly imprisoned before the two were forced to reconcile and go on together. Whether or not it happened just so, it captures something true about the character of the conquest, that it was carried out by ambitious and often rivalrous men, each grasping for his own portion of fame and plunder, and that its very speed was in part driven by the desire of each commander to reach the next rich prize before his rival did. Within 3 years, an incredible span for such a vast enterprise, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula had passed into Muslim hands. Toledo, the old capital, fell early and its treasures were carried away, including, so the legends said, a great table of gold and jewels that had once belonged to King Solomon himself and had been hoarded by the Visigothic kings. The great cities of the south, Cordoba and Seville and Malaga, came under the new rule. The east and the center followed. Even the far northwest, the remote and rainy corner of Galicia, was overrun. Only in the far northern mountains, in a small and rugged region called Asturias, where a handful of Visigothic nobles and Christian fighters retreated into the fastness of the peaks, did any independent Christian rule survive at all, and it was a survival so small and so poor that the conquerors scarcely noticed it, judging it not worth the effort of hunting down. Yet from that tiny mountain remnant, as we shall see, would spring, in the fullness of centuries, the seed of everything that would in the end undo the whole conquest. For the moment, though, it seemed of no consequence. The peninsula was theirs, nor did the Muslims stop at the peninsula. Once Iberia was in their grasp, the armies pressed on across the Pyrenees into what is now southern France, seeking new lands to add to their conquests. For 20 years, Muslim raiders and armies ranged across the south of Gaul, taking cities as far north as Narbonne, threatening Bordeaux, striking deep into the Frankish lands. And it was in the year 732, more than 2 decades after Tariq's landing at Gibraltar, that this great westward tide at last met a force strong enough to check it. Near the town of Poitiers in central France, a Muslim army under the governor of Al-Andalus met the Frankish forces of a hard warrior named Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, grandfather of the man who would one day be Charlemagne. In a hard-fought battle among the trees and fields, the Frankish infantry held their ground, the Muslim commander was killed, and the Muslim army withdrew back across the mountains. Later ages, particularly in the Christian West, would come to see this battle as one of the great turning points of history, the moment when the advance of Islam into Western Europe was finally halted. Whether it truly deserves quite so grand a place is still debated by historians, for the raiders would return more than once in the years that followed, and the true northern limit of Muslim Spain was fixed less by any single battle than by the long, quiet arithmetic of distance and supply. Yet it is true enough that after Poitiers, the tide never reached so high again, and the Pyrenees hardened over the following generations into the northern frontier of the new Muslim land. That land itself was now given a name. The Arabs called it Al-Andalus, a word whose exact origins scholars still argue over. Some say it came from an old name for the Vandal peoples who had passed through Spain centuries before. Others trace it to Gothic or Berber roots, and still others suggest it was simply a new Arabic coinage for a new place. Whatever its true source, the name stuck, and it would designate for 800 years the world of Muslim Iberia, however large or small that world became. For now, Al-Andalus was vast, stretching from Gibraltar in the south to the foothills of the Pyrenees in the north, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal in the west to the Mediterranean shores of Catalonia in the east. And it was governed at first as a distant province of the great Umayyad Caliphate, with a governor sent from Damascus to rule it in the caliph's name. Those early governors had a difficult time of it, for Al-Andalus in its opening decades was a turbulent place. The Arab conquerors and their Berber allies fell out with each other constantly, quarreling over the division of the conquered lands and over who deserved the richer share. Rival Arab factions carried their old tribal feuds with them from the deserts of the east and fought them out anew upon the hills of Spain. Governors rose and fell in swift succession, some assassinated, some deposed, some killed in battle against rebellious subordinates. And in the year 750, far away in the east, a great revolution overthrew the Umayyad caliphs of Damascus, replacing them with a new dynasty called the Abbasids, who moved the seat of the caliphate to a new city they would build called Baghdad. The Umayyad family was hunted down and slaughtered almost to the last man. Almost, but not quite. And what became of the one who escaped would set the course of Al-Andalus for centuries to come. Rest now, with the ship still rocking gently at Gibraltar, and a young man far to the east fleeing for his life across a desert, carrying with him the last hope of a fallen dynasty and the seed of a kingdom yet unborn. His name was Abd al-Rahman, and he was a grandson of one of the last Umayyad caliphs of Damascus. When the Abbasid revolution swept across the eastern lands in the year 750, and the new dynasty set about killing every member of the old ruling house they could find, Abd al-Rahman was a young man of about 20, and he watched almost his entire family perish in a matter of weeks. Uncles, brothers, cousins, all cut down in what became a systematic extermination. The Abbasids invited scores of surviving Umayyad princes to a banquet of reconciliation, and then had them all murdered as they sat at the table, and afterward laid carpets over the bodies and continued the feast atop the corpses. Abd al-Rahman was not there. He had fled north with his younger brother, hiding among the reeds along the banks of the Euphrates, and it was there, according to the old accounts, that the Abbasid horsemen at last caught up with them. His brother was captured and killed on the riverbank, but Abd al-Rahman plunged into the water and swam to the far shore, hearing the pleas of his brother behind him and being unable to help. He crawled out onto the opposite bank, alone in the world, his family gone, and set out to walk westward across a continent to find some corner of the earth where he might survive. For 5 years he wandered. He crossed the deserts of the east, passed through Egypt in disguise, moved along the North African coast, sometimes sheltered by loyal servants of his fallen house, sometimes hunted by Abbasid agents. His mother had been a Berber woman from the tribes of North Africa, and it was among her people that he at last found refuge. Slowly he began to gather about him a small band of followers, other Umayyad clients who had escaped the great killing, and to send messengers ahead of him into Al-Andalus, where he heard that the province was in such disorder that a bold man of the old dynasty might yet find a throne. For Al-Andalus, in these years, was tearing itself apart. The old feuds between the Arab factions had erupted into open civil war, and the governor sent from the east could barely hold the province together. Into this chaos, in the year 755, Abd al-Rahman crossed the strait from Africa, landing on the same shores where Tariq had landed 44 years before. The story of what followed is worthy of any legend. Abd al-Rahman, still not yet 30, gathered supporters from every faction that resented the current regime. He appealed to the old loyalists of his family, of whom many had settled in Al-Andalus after fleeing the east. He drew in the Yemeni Arabs, who were feuding with the Qasi Arabs, and the Berbers who resented the Arabs generally and dissatisfied ordinary men of every kind. Within a year of his landing, he had raised an army and marched upon the capital at Cordoba. The reigning governor met him outside the city walls, and in the battle that followed, the young pretender's forces won a decisive victory. The governor was killed, the city opened its gates, and Abd al-Rahman rode into Cordoba as the new master of Al-Andalus. He was proclaimed emir, prince, ruler in his own right, no longer a mere governor answering to any distant caliph. And there, in the far western corner of the Muslim world, he founded a new dynasty, the Umayyads of Cordoba, a branch of the great house whose eastern trunk had been so bloodily cut down. He would rule for 32 years, and he needed every one of them, for his throne was never secure. Rebellions broke out again and again across the peninsula, sometimes led by rival Arab lords who resented his rule, sometimes stirred up by Abbasid agents sent from Baghdad to bring the runaway Umayyad down. He crushed them all, one after another. On one famous occasion, the Abbasid caliph himself, the mighty Al-Mansur, sent an army against him, but Abd al-Rahman defeated it, and in a gesture of magnificent defiance, had the severed heads of the Abbasid commanders packed in salt, wrapped in the black banners of their dynasty, and sent as a grim message to Baghdad. When Al-Mansur received the parcel and understood what it contained, he is said to have exclaimed, "Thanks be to God, who has placed the sea between us and such a devil." Abd al-Rahman had made his point. The Umayyads of Cordoba were not a curiosity or a remnant. They were a power in their own right, and they meant to be treated as one. Yet for all his fierceness in war, Abd al-Rahman was also a man of surprising melancholy and refinement, and the two sides of him have come down to us together in a very human way. He had brought with him from the East not only ambition and grievance, but also a love of the gardens and the poetry and the fine building of his lost homeland, and he set about recreating something of Syria in the dry hills of Spain. He built himself a country estate outside Cordoba which he called Al-Rusafa after the summer palace of his grandfather in Damascus, and he planted it with the trees and flowers he remembered from his childhood. There is a poem attributed to him, written, they say, when a single date palm in his new garden, brought as a seedling from the east, at last matured and bore its first fruit. Looking at it, the old exile is said to have addressed it as a fellow stranger, saying that both of them were far from home. Both had come from a place they could never return to, and both had put down what roots they could in a foreign soil. Whether he truly wrote those verses or not, they capture the tone of the man and of the dynasty he founded, a longing for a lost East combined with a stubborn determination to build a new home in the West that would outshine anything the old one had been. Above all, Abd al-Rahman set his mind upon Cordoba itself. The city he had made his capital lay in a wide green valley along the Guadalquivir River, upon land that had once been a Roman town of some importance and that the Visigoths had inhabited without much distinction. Under the new emir, it began to grow, slowly at first, then with astonishing speed as the generations passed. Its walls were rebuilt, its markets expanded, its aqueducts and bridges repaired. And in the last years of his life, Abd al-Rahman began the greatest of his works, the building of a great mosque at the center of his city, upon the site of an old Visigothic church, itself built upon an older Roman temple. It was to be a place of worship worthy of a capital and worthy of a dynasty. He did not live to see it finished, but his son and grandsons and great-grandsons would carry the work forward, each of them adding their own halls and arcades to it, until in time the great mosque of Cordoba would become one of the wonders of the medieval world. That mosque, still standing today though transformed by later centuries, was and is an extraordinary thing. Its builders raised within it a forest of columns, hundreds of them, drawn from Roman ruins and Visigothic churches and quarries across the peninsula, marble and jasper and porphyry of every colour. And upon these columns they set two tiers of arches, one above the other, in bands of red brick and pale stone, so that the whole interior seems to rise into a strange striped canopy of arches marching away in every direction, like ranks of palm trees glimpsed through a low mist. To walk into, it was to lose one's bearings, for there was no single main aisle, no clear axis leading the eye forward. The space simply opened outward on all sides, endless and equal, a great cool hall of light and shadow where hundreds of worshippers could kneel in prayer. Nothing quite like it had been built before, and it announced to anyone who saw it that the Umayyads of Cordoba considered themselves the equal of any dynasty in the world. Beyond his building, Abd al-Rahman set patterns for governance that his successors would follow for generations. He organized the province into administrative districts, appointed governors he could trust, established a regular army partly composed of loyal Berbers and partly of slave soldiers brought from northern and eastern Europe. He created a court in the manner of the caliphs, with its viziers and secretaries and chamberlains, and he began the practice of granting stipends to poets and scholars who would praise his reign. He was cautious with religion, generally tolerant of the Christians and Jews who lived under his rule, insistent that they pay their tax and obey his law, but otherwise letting them worship as they wished. The Christians of Al-Andalus in these years continued to have their bishops and their churches, and even continued to speak a form of Latin among themselves for many generations. The Jews, freed from the persecutions of the Visigothic kings, flourished in the cities, and began that long and remarkable partnership with Arab culture that would produce, in later centuries, some of the greatest Jewish poets, philosophers, and scholars in all of history. Abd al-Rahman died in the year 788, an old man by the standards of his age and his line, and he was buried in Cordoba, in the city he had made his own. His work had been to make Al-Andalus a real polity, no longer a distant province, but a state in its own right, ruled by its own dynasty, defended by its own armies, honored by its own scholars and poets. His descendants would rule Cordoba for 250 years after him. And through those long generations, Al-Andalus would grow steadily more prosperous, more populous, more sophisticated, until it stood as one of the great civilizations of the medieval world, richer than any Christian kingdom of the West, its capital larger than any city in Europe outside Constantinople. Its scholars corresponded with by learned men in Baghdad and Cairo, its silks and its swords, and its books sold in markets from Africa to India. For all its splendor, though, the Cordoban emirate was not without its troubles. Rebellions still flared up in the frontier regions, particularly in the northeast, around the old Roman city of Zaragoza, and in the mountain territories where local governors often ruled almost as independent lords. The tiny Christian kingdom in the north, huddled in the Asturian mountains, slowly began to grow, pushing its borders a little southward each generation, though so slowly and against so much greater a power that no one in Cordoba thought it a serious threat. The lines between Arab and Berber, between old settler and new arrival, between Orthodox and heterodox Muslim, all these fissures ran through the society and sometimes broke open into violence. Yet even in its turbulence, the emirate held together, held by the strong hand of the dynasty Abd al-Rahman had planted, the greatest of his successors, and the man who would raise the Umayyad state to its highest glory would come almost 2 centuries after him. His name too would be Abd al-Rahman, the third of that name to rule Cordoba, and in his reign Al-Andalus would step out of the long shadow of Baghdad forever, claiming for itself a title no Western Muslim ruler had ever dared to claim. To that golden age we now turn. Rest now, with the date palm still growing in the exile's garden, and the striped arches of the great mosque rising slowly, stone by stone, in the warm Cordoban sun. The Cordoba into which Abd al-Rahman III was born in the year 891 was a city in trouble. His grandfather ruled as emir, but the emirate itself was fraying at every edge. Across the peninsula, ambitious local lords had risen up in open rebellion, carving out their own petty domains and refusing to pay tribute to the court. A rebel of mixed Arab and Christian ancestry named Umar ibn Hafsan had made himself the master of a great stronghold in the mountains and held sway over a large stretch of the south. The Christian kingdoms in the north, which had once seemed too small to matter, were pressing steadily southward, taking towns that had been Muslim for 2 centuries. In North Africa, a rival dynasty called the Fatimids had risen up, claiming the title of caliph for themselves and threatening the Umayyad flank across the strait. And within Cordoba itself, the different factions of Arabs and Berbers and native converts and slave soldiers eyed one another with suspicion, and each rebellion in the provinces stirred the embers of some old rivalry in the capital. When the young prince came to the throne in the year 912, at scarcely 21 years of age, many must have wondered whether the dynasty of his ancestors would survive his reign at all. He would rule for 50 years, and by the time he died, the emirate of his childhood would seem like a distant, half-remembered thing. For under Abd al-Rahman III, Al-Andalus rose to a splendor it had never known before and would never again quite match. He was a strange and formidable man, a person whom the sources describe as fair-haired and blue-eyed, taking after his Basque grandmother, so pale that he was said to dye his beard black to look more like the Arab prince he was expected to be. He was patient, careful, quietly ruthless, and he possessed a gift for reading the balance of power in every situation and for waiting until the moment was right to act. He did not begin his reign with grand pronouncements. He began it with the slow, patient work of restoring order. One by one, he brought the rebellious cities back under the crown. He marched against the sons of Umar ibn Hafsan, who had inherited their father's mountain stronghold, and after a long siege of the fortress at Bobastra, he took it and had the bodies of the old rebel and his sons dug up and displayed at the gates of Cordoba, so that all should see how the state dealt with those who defied it. He put down the rebellious governors of Seville and Toledo and Zaragoza, sometimes by force and sometimes by careful negotiation. He rebuilt the army and the navy, drawing men from every part of his realm and beyond, and he strengthened the fortifications along the northern frontier against the growing Christian kingdoms. Slowly, over 20 years, he pieced his crumbling inheritance back together, until at last, in the early 930s, Al-Andalus stood united under a single hand more firmly than it had for generations. Then, having secured his rule at home, he made a declaration that shook the whole Muslim world. In the year 929, Abd al-Rahman III proclaimed himself caliph. Until that moment, the title of caliph, meaning successor to the Prophet, had been claimed only by the rulers in Baghdad, and more recently by the upstart Fatimids in North Africa. For nearly 2 centuries, the Umayyads of Cordoba had held themselves as mere emirs, princes, technically inferior in rank to the caliphs of the East, even though they had long ceased to obey them in any practical way. Now Abd al-Rahman swept that fiction aside. He took the title Commander of the Faithful, Amir al-Mu'minin, and the further title al-Nasir li-Din Allah, meaning the defender of God's faith, and he had these titles struck upon his coins and read out in the Friday prayers in every mosque of his realm. He was declaring that Al-Andalus was no province of anyone, that its ruler answered to no one on earth, that the Umayyad house had at last reclaimed the title its ancestors had held in Damascus 2 centuries before. For the Muslim world it was a stunning move, and for Al-Andalus it was a transformation. The court at Cordoba now became, in ceremony and in substance, an imperial court. Ambassadors began to arrive from every direction, from Byzantium, from the German lands, from the courts of the Christian north, from the Berber kingdoms of Africa, all bringing gifts and treaties, all hoping to win the favor of the new caliph of the West. Scholars, poets, musicians, and craftsmen flocked to the city, drawn by the fame of its ruler and by the wealth he lavished upon those who served him. The great mosque was extended once again, its ranks of striped arches marching ever further, and the treasury of the caliphate began to fill with the wealth of a booming realm at peace. To make his imperial grandeur visible, Abd al-Rahman ordered the building of an entire new city just outside his capital, a palace city that would serve as the seat of his court and government, separate from and superior to the busy commercial capital itself. He called it Madinat al-Zahra, the city of Zahra, said to be named after a beloved concubine. It was raised upon a series of terraces climbing up the flank of a mountain northwest of Cordoba, so that the whole complex descended in three great levels toward the plain, the caliph's residence at the top, the administrative offices in the middle, and the gardens and lesser buildings below. It took 40 years to build, and thousands of workers labored upon it every day, and the accounts of its splendor are almost beyond belief. 10,000 men, they said, worked on the construction each day. 15,000 mules and 4,000 camels carried the stones. The reception hall of the caliph had a roof supported by pillars of marble, some brought from the ruins of Carthage across the sea, others from Constantinople itself. In the center of that hall stood a great bowl of mercury, and when the sunlight struck it, and the caliph's servants gave it a slight push, the shimmering liquid would send flashes of light dancing across the walls and ceiling, as though the very room were made of shifting stars. Visitors from distant lands who were admitted to that hall are said to have fallen upon their knees, thinking they had been brought before the sun itself. The receptions Abd al-Rahman held at Madinat al-Zahra were designed to overwhelm, and they succeeded. There is a famous story of an embassy that arrived from the Emperor of the Germans, sent to negotiate over Muslim raiders operating from a base in southern France. The ambassador, a bishop named John of Gauls, was a hard-headed man, and he waited nearly 3 years in Cordoba before he was granted an audience. When at last the day came, he was led through mile after mile of soldiers standing in perfect ranks, through gates hung with tapestries, along corridors lined with sweet-scented plants, past pools where fountains played, until he reached the chamber of the caliph. The caliph himself was seated alone upon a low throne, dressed in the plainest robes, without ornament of any kind, and yet the effect of everything around him was so magnificent that the bishop, hardened traveler though he was, later said he felt as though he had passed into another world. The court that filled these halls was as brilliant as its setting. Abd al-Rahman gathered around him the finest minds of the Islamic world. He brought the greatest scholar of the age, a physician and pharmacologist named Hasdai ibn Shaprat, a Jew from a distinguished family, and made him his personal doctor and one of his chief advisers, entrusting him with foreign correspondence and even with delicate diplomatic missions. Hasdai not only served the caliph brilliantly, but also became the great patron of Jewish learning in Al-Andalus, funding scholars and poets, and building the first great flowering of Hebrew literature in Spain, a flowering that would last for centuries. Nor was Hasdai alone. Around Abd al-Rahman clustered mathematicians and astronomers, geographers and historians, poets and grammarians, and the caliph gave them stipends and libraries, and the time to do their work. He founded a great library at Cordoba, and his son and grandson would expand it until it held, by some estimates, 400,000 volumes, at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe had scarcely 600 books. Under this patronage, Cordoba grew into the largest city in Europe west of Constantinople. It had, at its height, perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, at a time when Paris and London were small clusters of a few thousand souls. Its streets were paved, and its houses had running water carried in from the mountains through a system of aqueducts and cisterns. Its markets were divided by trade, one for silversmiths and another for silk weavers, one for booksellers and another for spice merchants, one for perfumers and another for the sellers of sweets. There were public baths in every quarter of the city, hundreds of them, warm and cold, and steam rooms where men and women, at different hours, could bathe as often as they liked. There were mosques by the score, and Christian churches, and synagogues, and schools where boys, and in the wealthier families, girls too, learned to read and write, and to recite the Quran or the Torah. At night, when the towns of Christian Europe lay in darkness, the streets of Cordoba were lit by oil lamps hung from posts, so that a person could walk safely from one quarter to another long after the sun had set. Travelers from beyond the Pyrenees who came to the city returned home speechless with what they had seen. Above all, Cordoba in these years was a place of extraordinary mixing. Arabs and Berbers, native Spaniards who had converted to Islam and who now formed the great majority of the population, Christians who kept their old faith and their old Latin liturgy, Jews who had thrived under Muslim rule for 2 centuries, all lived side by side in the same streets, spoke the same Arabic in the marketplace, wore variations of the same clothes, ate versions of the same food. It was not a paradise of perfect equality, and we should not pretend that it was. Christians and Jews paid a special tax and were subject to certain restrictions, could not build new churches without permission, could not ride certain animals or wear certain colors, and their testimony in court did not carry the weight of a Muslim's. But within those limits, they lived in remarkable peace, and their communities flourished, and the very language and culture of Al-Andalus was shaped as much by them as by their Muslim rulers. Later ages would come to speak of this arrangement by a Spanish word, convivencia, coexistence, and though scholars still argue about how well the label fits, it captures something true about Cordoba under the great Caliph, a society in which three faiths lived together, quarreled together, learned from one another, and produced together a civilization that neither could have made alone. Abd al-Rahman III died in the year 961, after 50 years upon the throne, in the palace city he had built. He left behind a set of tablets, they say, upon which he had kept a private record of the truly happy days of his long life, and when they were counted after his death, they numbered only 14. It is a strange and telling detail that even at the very peak of worldly power, a man might reckon so little peace among all his years. Yet what he had built would outlast him, at least for a little while. Rest now, with the fountains still playing at Madinat al-Zahra and the lamps of Cordoba burning against the soft summer dark. The son who followed Abd al-Rahman III upon the throne of Cordoba was a very different sort of man from his formidable father, and yet in his own quiet way he carried the golden age of Al-Andalus to its highest point. His name was Al-Hakam II, and he came to power already in middle age, for his father had lived so long that the son had passed nearly all his youth as a prince in waiting. Where the father had been a warrior and a statesman, Al-Hakam was above all a scholar. He loved books more than banquets, and libraries more than palaces, and when he became caliph in the year 961, he set about turning the whole apparatus of the state to the service of learning in a way that no ruler in the West had done before him. He continued the works his father had begun, adding new halls and mihrabs to the great mosque of Cordoba, and it was under him that its most breathtaking element was completed, the wall of the prayer niche called the mihrab, faced with mosaics of gold and colored glass sent as a gift by the Emperor of Byzantium. Byzantine craftsmen came with the tiles and worked alongside the local artisans to set them into place, so that the very wall where the imam led the prayer glittered with the same shimmering art that adorned the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. It was an extraordinary gesture that the emperor of the Eastern Christians should send his own workmen to help beautify a mosque in the far Muslim West. But Al-Hakam had that kind of standing in the world. He corresponded with rulers from Baghdad to Aachen, and he was courted by all of them. His true love, though, was his library, and he built it into something that no city west of the Tigris had ever possessed. He sent agents to Baghdad, to Cairo, to Damascus, to Alexandria, with open purses and orders to buy every book worth buying, and to have copies made of every book that could not be bought. He paid for translations from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. He ordered scholars to hunt down rare texts and to correct corrupt copies against better ones. He hired scribes and binders by the score and set them to work in a great copying house attached to the palace. By the end of his reign, the Library of Cordoba is said to have held some 400,000 volumes, and the catalogue of it alone filled 44 registers of 50 leaves each, listing not only every book, but the number of lines on every page. In a Christian world where a monastery of 100 books was thought rich, this was a treasure almost beyond imagining. Nor was the library merely a private collection for the caliph's own pleasure. Al-Hakam made scholarship a public enterprise. He founded schools throughout Cordoba, and he paid teachers to instruct poor children, so that even the sons of the humblest tradesmen might learn to read the Quran, and if they showed talent, go on to higher studies. He supported the great university that had grown up around the mosque, where students came from as far away as Persia to sit at the feet of the masters of law and theology and grammar. And he supported, quietly but consistently, the parallel flowering of Jewish and Christian learning that continued in the shadow of the Muslim schools. It was under al-Hakam that the Jewish community of Al-Andalus produced its first great generation of Hebrew poets and scholars of Hebrew grammar, patronized by the caliph's Jewish physician and advisor, Hasdai ibn Shaprot, whom he had inherited from his father and continued to trust. And it was in these same years that Christian scholars in the northern parts of the peninsula began to travel south to Al-Andalus to learn Arabic, in order to read the Greek philosophy and the Indian mathematics and the Persian medicine that only the Muslim world possessed. The learning of Cordoba, silently and slowly, was beginning to leak northward into Latin Christendom, though few in either place yet realized how much would eventually flow along that channel. The problem for al-Hakam, and for the dynasty he served, was that a scholarly caliph, however brilliant, could not by himself hold together a state as complex as Al-Andalus had become. The empire his father had rebuilt required constant vigilance, constant campaigning, constant management of rival factions in the court and the army and the provinces. Al-Hakam, whose heart was in his books, delegated more and more of this work to trusted subordinates. And chief among these was a rising figure who had begun his career as a humble legal clerk, and would end it, before he was through, as the true master of Al-Andalus, ruler in all but name of the caliphate that his sovereign preferred to leave in his hands. His name was Ibn Abi Amir, and he would come to be known by the title he chose for himself, Al-Mansur, the Victorious. Al-Mansur was one of those men whom every age of history produces, a person of enormous talent and enormous ambition, who by a mixture of cunning, cruelty, and sheer capacity manages to raise himself from nothing to almost everything. He had come to the court as a young man of good family, but no fortune, taken employment as a scribe, and by careful attention to those who could help him, had worked his way into the household of the caliph's chief concubine, the Basque-born Sub, mother of the crown prince. Through her, he obtained more and more responsible positions, and by the time al-Hakam died in the year 976, leaving the throne to his young son Hisham II, a boy of only 11, al-Mansur was already positioned at the heart of the state. Within a few years, he had pushed aside every rival, secluded the boy caliph inside the palace complex behind walls that no ordinary subject could pass, and taken effective control of the whole government into his own hands. What he did with that power was extraordinary, and for a time it seemed to raise Al-Andalus even higher than before. Al-Mansur was above all a soldier, and he understood that a state such as his rested in the end upon the sword. He reorganized the army completely, breaking up the old tribal units of Arabs and Berbers and mixing men together in new regiments of his own devising, so that no group could form a coherent block against him. He recruited great numbers of Berber warriors from across the strait, until they became the backbone of his forces, and he purchased slave soldiers from northern Europe, tall, pale-skinned men called Slavs, whom he trained into a personal guard of terrifying loyalty. Then, with this new army, he did what no ruler of Al-Andalus had done in generations. He turned northward and made war upon the Christian kingdoms with a ferocity and a regularity that had no equal in the annals of the peninsula. Every year, for more than 20 years, Al-Mansur led an army into the Christian north. Sometimes 2 campaigns in a single year, spring and autumn, once the harvest was safely in. He struck at Leon, at Castile, at Navarre, at Catalonia, at Galicia, at every Christian territory that had grown up in the mountains and the valleys of the north during the long centuries when Cordoba had left them largely alone. He burned their fields, sacked their towns, dragged off their inhabitants as slaves. In one of his most famous expeditions, in the year 997, he marched all the way to the far northwestern corner of the peninsula, to the great shrine city of Santiago de Compostela, where the tomb of Saint James the Apostle was the holiest pilgrimage site in the Western Christian world after Rome itself. He sacked the city, tore down its cathedral, and in a gesture designed to break the spirit of his enemies, forced Christian captives to carry the great bells of the cathedral all the way back to Cordoba on their backs, where he had them hung upside down in the great mosque and used as lamps. It was a moment of shattering humiliation for the Christians of the north, and a moment of tremendous prestige for Al-Mansur. He had gone further into their heartland than any Muslim army in centuries, and he had come home in triumph. He conducted no fewer than 52 military campaigns in his career, and by tradition he lost none of them. His nickname, Al-Mansur, was well earned, and he used the immense prestige and wealth these victories brought him to consolidate his personal grip on the caliphate. He had his own son, named as his eventual successor in the position of chief minister, in effect making the office hereditary in his family. He built himself a new palace city to rival Madinat al-Zahra, called al-Madinah al-Zahira, from which he ruled while the young Caliph Hisham lived his quiet, secluded life in the older palace, seen by almost no one, brought out on ceremonial occasions, and then hidden away again. Coins were still struck in Hisham's name, prayers were still said in his name in the mosques, but everyone in Al-Andalus and everyone in the wider Muslim world understood who truly ruled. For a while, this arrangement worked, and worked brilliantly. Under Al-Mansur, Al-Andalus reached the outermost limit of its military power. The Christian kingdoms were driven into a defensive posture from which they would not recover for 2 full generations. The tribute they were forced to pay flowed into the coffers of Cordoba in great quantities. The armies of the Caliphate were the most formidable in the Western Mediterranean, and within Al-Andalus, at least on the surface, the great golden age seemed to continue. The scholars still wrote their books, the poets still praised their patrons, the artisans still worked marble and ivory and silk. Madinat al-Zahra still glittered with its fountains and its polished stones. Yet beneath this seeming continuity of glory, Al-Mansur had done something to the state that would prove fatal in the end. He had broken the old structure of the caliphate without replacing it with anything that could survive him. The traditional balance of power between the caliph, the great Arab families, the Berber tribes, and the slave soldiers had all been overturned to elevate his own personal position. The dynasty of the Umayyads had been reduced to a figurehead. The army had been packed with new Berber troops whose loyalty was to him alone. The great families whose long service had given the state its continuity had been pushed aside. So long as Al-Mansur lived, his personal genius held it all together, but he was mortal, like all men. And when at last he died in the year 1002 on campaign in the north, his son took over his position, and for a few more years the great edifice seemed to stand. But when that son also died shortly afterward, and a lesser grandson of Al-Mansur attempted to seize the caliphate for himself in his own name, everything came apart with a suddenness that stunned the world. The great fitna, the civil war, had begun, and in the space of 20 years, the caliphate that Abd al-Rahman III had raised to such splendor would tear itself to pieces, and the golden Cordoba of the great mosque and the 400,000 books would burn. Rest now, with the bells of Compostela hanging silent in the Cordoban mosque, and the long shadow of one ambitious man stretched across a caliphate that will not outlive him for long. The catastrophe that fell upon Al-Andalus in the years after Al-Mansur's death is one of the most swift and shocking collapses in medieval history. In the space of a single generation, the mightiest state in the Western Mediterranean, the Caliphate of Cordoba that had dazzled ambassadors from Byzantium and Baghdad, that had built Madinat al-Zahra and gathered 400,000 books, dissolved into chaos and blood. What took 2 centuries to build was undone in barely 20 years. And when the dust at last began to settle, the great unified realm was gone, and in its place stood a shattered patchwork of small kingdoms squabbling with one another among the ruins. The trouble began in the year 1008, when Al-Mansur's second son, a man history remembers as Sanchulo, made a fateful mistake. Not content with holding the same power his father and elder brother had wielded from behind the throne, he demanded that the Caliph Hisham formally name him as his heir. It was an act of overreaching ambition, for it broke the last polite fiction that had held the system together, the fiction that the Umayyad dynasty still ruled and the Amirid family merely served. When Sanchulo then rode north on a campaign against the Christians, leaving Cordoba lightly guarded, the descendants of the old Umayyads and their supporters saw their chance. A young cousin of Hisham named Mohammed seized the palace, deposed the reigning caliph, and had himself proclaimed in his place. Sanchulo turned back in a hurry when he heard the news, but his army melted away as it marched, and he was caught and killed on the road, his head brought back to Cordoba on a pike. The Amirid dynasty was finished in a single stroke, but what followed was worse than what came before. For the new Caliph Mohammed II, having taken the throne, promptly alienated the very forces that had put him there. He offended the Berber troops of the army, who had been Al-Mansur's mainstay, by favoring the Slav guards over them and by threatening their pay. The Berbers rose in revolt and marched upon Cordoba. Mohammed hastily reinstated the old Caliph Hisham as a figurehead and tried to negotiate, but the Berbers would have none of it. They elected a new caliph of their own from among another branch of the Umayyad family, and civil war broke out in earnest. Over the following years, a bewildering succession of rival caliphs was raised up and cast down. Some ruled for months, some for weeks, some for barely days. Cordoba changed hands again and again, each time with fresh massacres and lootings. In the year 1013, the Berber army broke into the city, and the great palace city of Madinat al-Zahra, which had stood for less than a century as the wonder of the West, was sacked and set ablaze. Its marble halls were stripped, its columns broken, its mosaics torn from the walls, its libraries scattered, its gardens trampled. The three-tiered dream city of the caliphs was reduced to smoking rubble within a matter of days. It has never been rebuilt. To this day, its ruins lie in the hills outside Cordoba, patiently excavated by archaeologists, a haunting reminder of what was lost. The great library of Al-Hakam was also destroyed in these years, or at least dispersed beyond recovery. Some volumes were sold off to pay armies, others burned in the fighting, still others carried away by refugees fleeing the ruined city. The 400,000 books, gathered so patiently by two generations of caliphs, were scattered like leaves in a storm, and though some survived to shape the learning of later ages, the great treasure as a whole was gone. The population of Cordoba, which at its height had been perhaps 500,000 souls, collapsed as people fled the violence, and by the time the worst of the fighting was over, the city held only a fraction of what it once had. Travelers passing through in later years found whole quarters empty and silent, their houses in ruins, their gardens gone to weeds. The last of the puppet caliphs was deposed in the year 1031, and the notables of Cordoba, seeing that the office had become a mockery, abolished it altogether. There would be no more caliphs of the West. The great title that Abd al-Rahman III had claimed with such ceremony a century before was quietly retired, and Al-Andalus entered a new and very different age. In place of the single realm, there arose a scatter of small independent kingdoms, each ruled by whichever local governor or general or ambitious noble had managed to seize control of a city and its surrounding territory when the central authority collapsed. Historians call this the period of the Taifa kingdoms, from the Arabic word taifa, meaning faction or party, and it would last for the better part of half a century. There were, at the height of the fragmentation, some 24 or more of these little kingdoms, of every size and character. Some were ruled by Arab families of ancient lineage, like the Abbadids of Seville, who took the largest and richest of the fragments and made it a real regional power. Others were ruled by Berber dynasties from the tribes that had come across the strait in Al-Mansur's time and now settled themselves as lords of the lands they had once garrisoned. Still others were ruled by Slavs, those pale-skinned soldiers imported from the north as slave warriors, some of whom now became princes in their own right, especially in the eastern parts of the peninsula. Toledo, high on its rocky hill, became the capital of one of the largest taifas, ruled by a dynasty called the Dihulnunids. Zaragoza in the north was another, Badajoz in the west, Granada in the south, Malaga on the coast, Almeria, Valencia, Denaya, Murcia, and many smaller places besides. Each had its own king or its own petty prince, its own court, its own coinage, its own quarrels with its neighbors. The Taifa kings, cut off from the great tradition of the caliphate and unable to command the loyalty that the Umayyads had inspired, ruled from insecurity, and they knew it. They could not draw upon a shared myth of legitimacy, for none of them had any claim to be the successor of the Prophet. What they had was money, taken from their taxes and their trade, and increasingly from their pockets to pay the demands of the Christian kingdoms to the north. For the Christian kingdoms, so long held at bay by Al-Mansur and his father, now saw the great weakness of their neighbor and moved to exploit it. Rather than launching outright campaigns of conquest, at least at first, the Christian kings developed a shrewd system of extortion. They would threaten a Taifa king with war, and the Taifa king, unable to face them alone, would pay a great sum of gold and silver to be left in peace. This tribute, called parias, flowed northward in ever greater quantities year after year, enriching the small Christian realms of Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, and impoverishing the wealthy Muslim cities of the south. The Taifa kings raised the money by squeezing their own subjects harder, imposing new taxes not sanctioned by Islamic law, and this in turn made them still more unpopular and still more insecure. Yet, for all their political weakness, the Taifa kingdoms produced something remarkable in the cultural realm. Cut off from a single glorious center, each little court set itself to become a miniature Cordoba, and they competed with one another in the patronage of poets, philosophers, musicians, and scholars. The result was one of the most extraordinary flowerings of Arabic poetry in all of history, and a great age of Jewish culture besides. In Seville, the Abbasid kings were themselves poets, and their court was thronged with singers and versifiers. King Al-Mu'tamid of Seville, who came to the throne in 1069, was one of the finest poets of the age, and his verses of love and longing, and later, of exile and defeat, are still read as among the treasures of the Arabic tongue. In Granada, at a smaller court, the Jewish vizier Samuel Harnagid was not only a great minister of state and a general who led his master's armies in battle, but also the greatest Hebrew poet of the age, whose lines of war and wine and worship still stand at the head of the medieval Hebrew canon. In Zaragoza, in Toledo, in Almeria, in each of the Taifa capitals, similar scenes played out. Kings spending money they could ill afford to keep their courts brilliant, to hire the finest talent, to make their little kingdom seem as splendid as Cordoba had once been. There is something poignant about this cultural brilliance rising from the wreckage of political unity. The Taifa period is often called, with justice, a silver age following the golden one, and its silver was of a very fine and very sad quality. The poets of these courts wrote often of loss, of the vanished glory of the caliphate, of the shadow that was gathering upon their world. They wrote love poetry of the most refined kind, and drinking poetry, and poems in praise of gardens and fountains. But underneath even the merriest verse, there ran a note of anxiety, of knowing that the world they inhabited was smaller than the world their grandfathers had known, and that the light was fading around them even as they danced. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms of the north grew steadily bolder. In the year 1085, the king of Castile and Leon, Alfonso VI, marched south and did what no Christian ruler had done in nearly 4 centuries. He took the ancient city of Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, the greatest inland city of the peninsula, and he took it not by sack, but by surrender, as its Muslim ruler acknowledged that he could not defend it and rode away. It was a shattering blow to Muslim Al-Andalus. Toledo was not merely a city, it was a symbol, the ancient seat of the Christian kings before the conquest, and now the first great capital to fall back into Christian hands. When the news reached the other Taifa kings, panic spread through their courts. If Toledo could fall, so could any of them, so could Seville, so could Cordoba itself. Alfonso, flush with his triumph, began to demand ever greater payments of tribute, and to hint that if the Taifas would not pay, he would come and take what he wanted. Some of the Christian sources of the time record him styling himself, half in seriousness, emperor of the 2 religions, ruler of Christians and Muslims alike. In desperation, the Taifa kings did something that would change Al-Andalus forever, and in the eyes of many, doom it. They looked across the strait for help. Across in North Africa, a new power had risen in the deserts of the West, a Berber movement of great religious severity and great military strength, called the Almoravids. They had built a mighty empire that stretched from Senegal to the northern coast of Morocco, ruled from a new city called Marrakesh. They were pure warriors of the faith, austere and hard, disdainful of the soft luxury of the Taifa courts, and known throughout the Muslim world as fierce defenders of Islam. To them, the sophisticated but frightened kings of Al-Andalus now sent embassies, begging for their help against the Christian advance. Rest now, with Madinat al-Zahra burning in the hills, and a fleet gathering upon the African shore, ready to answer a desperate call for help. The man who received the desperate embassies from Al-Andalus was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the founder and ruler of the Almoravid Empire, and he was in every way the opposite of the perfumed Taifa kings who begged for his help. He was in his 70s when they came to him, an old warrior of the desert, lean and hard, his skin darkened by the African sun, dressed in the plain woolen robes of his people. He drank no wine, listened to no music, kept no palace of marble and mosaic. His capital at Marrakesh was a rough mud brick town in the shadow of the Atlas Mountains, and its greatest ornament was its plainness. He rode a camel more often than a horse, and when he prayed as a soldier prays, briefly and fiercely, and then returned to the business of war. His people, the Almoravids, were themselves Berbers of the Sanhaja Confederation, tribes from the deep Saharan west who had been welded into a fighting brotherhood by a religious preacher some 2 generations before. They took their name from the Ribat, the fortified religious camp where the movement had begun, and they followed a strict interpretation of the Maliki school of Islamic law, austere, literal, suspicious of subtlety, contemptuous of the fine philosophical and mystical currents that had grown up in the cities of Al-Andalus. When the Taifa king's embassies reached him, Yusuf was cautious at first. He was an old man, and the crossing of the strait was no small undertaking, and the reputation of the Andalusians as a soft and quarrelsome people had reached even him. But when he heard how great the tribute was that they were paying to Alphonse VI, and how the Christian king was speaking of himself as ruler of 2 religions, and how the great city of Toledo had fallen, he judged that the honor of Islam itself required him to act. In the year 1086, he assembled his army, marched it to the African coast, and crossed the strait to Al-Andalus. The Taifa kings met him with elaborate ceremony, and together their combined forces marched north to meet Alfonso. The 2 armies came together at a place called Sagrajas in the plain of Extremadura, and there, in a hard-fought battle, the combined Muslim army broke Alfonso's forces so thoroughly that the Christian king barely escaped with his life, riding through the night with a small band of survivors. It was the greatest defeat any Christian ruler of the peninsula had suffered in generations, and it stunned all of Christian Iberia. The Almoravid triumph seemed to reverse in a single afternoon the whole momentum of the past 20 years. Alfonso's expansion was halted, the parias, the tribute payments, dried up, and Yusuf ibn Tashfin, having done what he had come to do, took his army back across the strait and returned to Africa, expecting the Taifa kings to have learned their lesson and to defend themselves thereafter. They had not. Within a few years, the old quarrels had begun again. The Taifa kings, freed from the immediate Christian threat, resumed their squabbles with one another, resumed their soft courts, resumed even, in some cases, their tribute payments to Alfonso. And Yusuf, watching from Marrakesh, drew his own conclusions. He had come once to save these princes, and they had proved unworthy of salvation. If Al-Andalus was to be defended for Islam, it would have to be defended by men who took the faith seriously, and the Taifa kings were not such men. He gathered his forces once more, crossed the strait a second time, and this time he did not come to help the Taifa kings. He came to overthrow them. Between the years 1090 and 1094, in a swift and ruthless campaign, Yusuf's Almoravid armies deposed the Taifa dynasties one after another. Granada fell first, its king exiled to Morocco. Seville followed. The great poet king Al-Mu'tamid of Seville, who had opened his gates to Yusuf as an ally only a few years before, was now stripped of his throne, chained, and sent as a prisoner across the strait to spend the rest of his life in exile in a small town in the Atlas foothills. From that exile, he wrote some of the most heartbreaking poetry in the Arabic language, verses of loss and humiliation, of the shame of chains upon a king's ankles, of the taste of coarse bread after the delicacies of Seville. He died there, far from home, and his poems still make readers weep across the centuries. His fate was the fate of nearly all the Taifa rulers. City by city, kingdom by kingdom, The Almoravids swallowed them up until nearly the whole of Muslim Al-Andalus was united once again, but this time under an African dynasty and a very different spirit. The Almoravid rule brought back military strength, and for a time the Christian advance was halted along a stable frontier. But it also brought a new religious hardness that many in Al-Andalus found stifling. The Almoravid scholars, ill at ease with the sophisticated Islamic culture they found in Córdoba and Seville and Granada, moved to suppress what they regarded as innovations and errors. Philosophy was frowned upon. Certain works of the great mystical writers were ordered burned. Restrictions upon Christians and Jews, which had grown lax in the Taifa years, were reimposed. Wine, music, and poetry of the amorous kind were officially discouraged, though such things could never be entirely stamped out and continued in private. The great Persian theologian Al-Ghazali's works were briefly banned as too subtle for the plain minds of the desert warriors. There is a note of complaint that runs through the writings of Andalusian scholars of these years, a sense that a rougher, less cultivated people had come and imposed themselves upon a more refined civilization. It was not fair to the Almoravids, who had their own real virtues and their own genuine piety, but it was how the change felt to many who lived through it. Yet, even so, some of the greatest cultural achievements of Muslim Spain belong to these years and the ones that followed. It was in this period that a poet in Córdoba named Ibn Hazm, a scholar of theology and law who had known the palaces of the caliphate as a boy, wrote a small book called The Ring of the Dove, a treatise on the nature of love that is one of the most humane and psychologically subtle works of the medieval world. And a little later, in the 12th century, would come the two greatest philosophers Al-Andalus ever produced, both born within a few years of each other in Córdoba, though neither would spend most of his life there. One was the Muslim thinker Ibn Rushd, known to the Latin West as Averroes, who wrote enormous commentaries on the works of Aristotle that would go on to shape the whole tradition of European philosophy when they were translated into Latin in the following century. The other was the Jewish thinker Moses ben Maimon, called Maimonides, whose Guide of the Perplexed would become one of the foundational works of medieval Jewish thought, and who himself would flee the peninsula in his youth to escape a later wave of Berber persecution, and would spend his life as a physician and philosopher in Egypt. That both of these towering minds should have been born in the same city within a decade of each other says something about what Al-Andalus was, even in its silver decline, still capable of producing. Almoravid rule did not last very long in the end. Yusuf ibn Tashfin himself died in the year 1106, the astonishing age of 100, but his successors were less capable men, and the empire they inherited was already showing strains. In North Africa, a new religious movement was rising, again among the Berber tribes, but this time in the Atlas Mountains rather than the desert, and its founders preached against the Almoravids as men who had grown lax and worldly. They called themselves the Almohads, the ones who proclaim the oneness of God, and they preached a doctrine even more austere than the Almoravids' own. By the middle of the 12th century, they had overthrown the Almoravid dynasty in Africa and had crossed the strait to take up its inheritance in Al-Andalus, and they were harsher still. Under the Almohads, the Christian and Jewish communities of Muslim Spain, which had lived for centuries under the protected status of dhimmi, were faced with something unprecedented, a demand that they choose between conversion to Islam and exile. Many converted outwardly and kept their old faith in secret. Many others fled north to the Christian kingdoms, or east to Egypt, or elsewhere. It was in this crisis that the young Maimonides and his family left Córdoba, and it was under the Almohads that the great pluralistic culture of Al-Andalus received its heaviest blow from within. Yet the Almohads too were formidable warriors, and for a time they held the peninsula against the Christian kingdoms with real effectiveness. In 1195, they won a great battle at Alarcos against the King of Castile, so decisive that it seemed to reverse everything the Christians had gained since the fall of Toledo a century before. But the Christians learned from their defeat. The kings of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre, together with the small kingdom of Portugal that had by now emerged as an independent realm on the Atlantic coast, began to see that only by joining forces could they resist the African-backed Muslim power. And in the year 1212, they did just that. That summer, a great army was gathered, drawn from all the Christian kingdoms of the peninsula and swelled by crusaders from beyond the Pyrenees, all of them summoned by the Pope in Rome to fight what he had declared a crusade against the Almohad Caliph. They marched south into the Sierra Morna, the range of low mountains that divided the plains of Castile from the valley of the Guadalquivir. And there, at a place called Las Navas de Tolosa, they met the Almohad army in full force. The battle that followed was one of the decisive engagements of the entire 800-year history of Al-Andalus. The Christian kings, fighting in a coalition they had never before achieved, drove the Almohad army from the field with terrible slaughter. The Almohad Caliph escaped with only a small band of followers, and his empire in Al-Andalus never recovered. Within a generation, the Almohads had been driven back to Africa, and the political unity of Muslim Spain was finished for good. What remained was a scatter of local rulers unable to withstand the tide that was now flowing steadily southward. The Christian kings pressed their advantage without mercy. Ferdinand, the Third of Castile, took Córdoba itself in 1236, and then, a few years later, Seville. James the First of Aragon conquered Valencia and the Balearic Islands. The Portuguese completed the reconquest of the Atlantic coast. In little more than half a century after Las Navas de Tolosa, the great cities of Al-Andalus, one after another, passed under Christian rule. Only one small kingdom in the far south, tucked into the mountains where the Sierra Nevada rose above the coast, managed to survive. Rest now, with the great banner of Islam falling on a hot summer field in the Sierra Morna, and one small kingdom in the mountains preparing to hold on for 250 years more. The kingdom that remained, when everything else had fallen, was Granada, and its survival, so late and so long against odds so heavy, is one of the strangest and most beautiful chapters in the whole story of Al-Andalus. When Ferdinand III took Córdoba and then Seville, and the great cities of the south passed one after another into Christian hands, it seemed only a matter of time before the last Muslim territories would fall as well. Yet in the far south, in the sheltered valleys and steep mountains around the old city of Granada, a small emirate held on. It survived not by military strength alone, though its warriors were brave, and not by wealth, though its trade was clever, but by a combination of geography, diplomacy, and the willingness of its rulers to accept a difficult and often humiliating relationship with the great Christian kingdom of Castile that surrounded it on almost every side. The man who founded this last kingdom was Mohammed ibn Nasser, a chieftain from the city of Arjona in the north of Andalusia, who in the chaos following the Almohad collapse had made himself master first of his own hometown and then of a growing patch of territory in the south. In the year 1238, when the tide of Christian conquest was already flowing hard, he entered the city of Granada and made it his capital. His dynasty, taking its name from him, would be called the Nasrids, and they would rule Granada for 254 years, which is astonishing when one considers how narrowly they held on. His genius, and the genius of the ablest of his successors, was to understand that Granada could not win a war of resistance against a united Castile. What it could do was be useful, or unthreatening, or divided against itself in ways that suited its Christian neighbors, or in some cases actively helpful to them. So Mohammed ibn Nasser became, from the very beginning, a vassal of the King of Castile. He paid tribute. He rendered military service when called upon. When Ferdinand III besieged Seville, the Emir of Granada himself brought troops to help the Castilian king take that great Muslim city from its ruler, a distant kinsman. It was an act that stained him in the eyes of many who told the story afterward, but it bought Granada its survival for another 2.5 centuries. The Nasrid kingdom fitted itself into the political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula, not as a rival, but as a client, a small buffer state whose value to Castile lay in what it could pay and what it could provide, and whose existence Castile therefore preferred to preserve rather than to end. Whenever the balance seemed likely to shift, whenever Castile turned its full attention southward, Granada could point to its role and its usefulness and pay a little more tribute and buy a little more time. Yet within its borders, the kingdom that made these compromises with the outside world was, at its best, a small marvel. Granada in the 14th century was one of the most sophisticated and cultivated cities in all of Europe, its craftsmen among the finest in the Mediterranean, its silks and its leather work, and its ceramics prized in markets as far away as Cairo and Damascus. Its population had been swelled by the great refugee movements of the previous century, as Muslims fleeing Córdoba, Seville, Valencia, and the other lost cities poured south into the last remaining Muslim territory. It was a kingdom of exiles, in a sense, a distilled remnant of the whole Andalusian civilization, gathered into a small space between the mountains and the sea. And what these exiled and second-generation exiled families built in Granada, especially in the 14th century, was one of the wonders of the medieval world. That wonder is the Alhambra. It stands upon a red hill above the city, and its name comes from an Arabic phrase meaning the red one, from the color of the earth from which it rose. The Nasrid emirs made it their palace fortress, and each generation added to it, adding new courtyards, new towers, new halls, new chambers, so that by the end it was less a single palace than a small city of palaces, spread across the hilltop within a great encircling wall. Its outer walls were plain and forbidding, the walls of a serious military fortress, and this was deliberate. The Alhambra was built in an age when it was known that the kingdom might have to defend itself at any moment. But when a visitor passed through its gates and entered its inner courtyards, the plainness fell away and something extraordinary opened up. The inner spaces of the Alhambra are among the most exquisite architectural creations of the human hand in any age. There are two great palaces at the heart of the complex, each built around a courtyard, and each courtyard contains a body of still water. In one, called the Court of the Myrtles, a long rectangular reflecting pool lies at the center, bordered by neatly clipped myrtle hedges, and at either end rise arcades whose slender columns and delicate arches are mirrored in the water below, so that one seems to walk between two identical worlds, one solid and one liquid. In the other, called the Court of the Lions, 12 stone lions carved of white marble hold up a great fountain in the center, and from that fountain water runs out in 4 channels along the ground, dividing the court into quarters after the fashion of the old paradise gardens of Persia. All around these courts stand walls covered from floor to ceiling in the most intricate ornament imaginable, plaster carved into stalactite-like clusters that hang from the ceilings as though frozen in mid-drip, walls of geometric tile in blues and greens and blacks and yellows, and above all, the flowing script of Arabic calligraphy, running everywhere across the plaster in graceful bands that spell out verses of poetry and verses of the Quran, so that the very walls of the palace speak, quite literally, praising God and the ruler who built them. One phrase, in particular, is repeated over and over throughout the Alhambra in 100 different scripts and settings until one begins to see it wherever one looks. It says, "There is no victor but God." The Nasrid emirs chose this as the motto of their dynasty and had it inscribed everywhere in their palace, and it is difficult, walking through those rooms today, not to feel the pathos of the choice. The men who commissioned those walls knew perfectly well that they were a small kingdom surrounded by a much greater power. They knew that their independence rested on payments and diplomacy and the goodwill of their neighbors, which could be withdrawn at any time. They knew that the great sweep of Muslim conquests, which had once carried their ancestors from Arabia to the Atlantic, had ended long ago and had begun to recede. And so they carved into the plaster of their most private courtyards a reminder that no earthly ruler is truly victorious, that all human power is temporary, that in the end there is only one victor, and that is God. It is a phrase of both piety and quiet resignation, and it hangs over the whole story of Nasrid Granada. Life in this last kingdom of Al-Andalus was, for those who lived within its walls, a strange mixture of splendor and precariousness. The city itself, spread along the slopes below the Alhambra, was crowded with houses whose plain outer walls concealed inner courtyards of fountains and orange trees. Its streets climbed and twisted between whitewashed walls, opening suddenly onto viewpoints from which one could see the fertile plain called the Vega stretching away below, its fields of wheat and barley, and its groves of olive and pomegranate tended by a farming population that had been there for centuries. The markets of Granada sold silks and swords and glazed pottery, sugar refined from cane grown along the coast, dried fruit and honey and saffron. Its scholars still taught in the mosque schools, though they were fewer than they had been in the days of Cordoba, and its poets still composed verses, though now with an ever more insistent note of mourning for a fading world. Its Jewish community, expelled from Christian kingdoms to the north or fleeing the Almohad persecutions of the previous century, still flourished in the city, engaged in trade and in learning, and formed part of the mosaic of Nasrid Granada. But the politics of the kingdom were troubled, and grew more troubled as the years passed. The Nasrid dynasty was riven by court intrigues and by rivalries within the royal family. Fathers were overthrown by sons, brothers by brothers, uncles by nephews. Some of the 23 emirs who ruled between the founding of the dynasty and its fall were remarkable men, patient rulers who bought their kingdom another decade or two of survival. Others were weak or paranoid or driven from the throne after only a few years. There were factions among the noble families that supported different claimants, and these factions sometimes flared into open civil war within the tiny kingdom's borders. And beyond the borders, Castile watched. As long as the kingdom paid its tribute and did not make trouble, and as long as Castile itself was distracted by its own affairs, the arrangement held. But it was always understood that if the balance tipped, Granada would fall. For most of the 14th and 15th centuries, Castile was indeed distracted. Its kings quarreled with their nobles. There were civil wars over succession, especially the great struggle between King Peter the Cruel and his half-brother in the mid-14th century. There were wars with Portugal and Aragon. There was the terrible visitation of the Black Death, which killed a third or more of the population of the peninsula. Granada, in each of these troubles, benefited from being small and beneath notice. But then, in the second half of the 15th century, everything changed. In the year 1469, two Christian monarchs married one another whose union would prove fatal to Muslim Spain. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon combined the two greatest Christian kingdoms of the peninsula into a single dynastic union, and though the two crowns remained legally distinct, in practice the two rulers governed as one. They set about restoring order in their own realms, subduing their unruly nobles, strengthening their central authority, and building an army and a treasury on a scale that no previous Iberian rulers had commanded. And when they had done these things, they turned their combined attention to the last remaining Muslim kingdom on the peninsula. Granada, by this time, was again riven by internal conflict. Two factions of the royal family were at war with each other, an old emir named Abu al-Hassan Ali against his own son, a young man named Mohammed, whom history remembers by his Spanish nickname, Boabdil. And into that split kingdom, in the year 1482, Ferdinand and Isabella launched the first campaign of what would become a 10-year war, patient, methodical, and this time meant to end the whole long story of Al-Andalus once and for all. Rest now, with the still water reflecting the arches of the Court of the Myrtles, and a young prince named Boabdil packing his rooms in the Alhambra, sensing already that the walls he loves so much may not stand much longer. The war that ended Al-Andalus was not a single great campaign, but a long, grinding series of sieges and skirmishes stretched across a decade, and it was fought in a very different style from the wars of the earlier Reconquest. Ferdinand and Isabella did not march an army into the heart of the kingdom and try to force a decisive battle. They knew that Granada, protected by its mountains and by the loyalty of its people, could not be taken so easily. Instead, they set out to strangle it slowly, town by town, valley by valley, cutting off one piece of the emirate at a time, and consolidating what they had won before moving on. It was a war of patience and of logistics, of great trains of supplies moving south along carefully guarded roads, of cannon dragged with immense labor into position before mountain fortresses, of walls battered down, and populations either killed, expelled, or absorbed as new subjects of the Christian crown. The final generation of the Granadan War was, in a sense, the first modern European campaign, fought with artillery and paid professional soldiers, as much as with the older feudal levies, and Ferdinand and Isabella brought to it a will and a patience that broke the will and the patience of their enemy. The first great blow fell early. In the year 1482, a Castilian force seized the town of Alhama, in the heart of the emirate not far from Granada itself, in a swift surprise attack that stunned the whole kingdom. The loss of Alhama sent a wave of grief through Granada, and a famous lament arose in the streets of the capital, a mourning song in which the people cried, "Ay de mi Alhama, woe is my Alhama," that has passed into Spanish literature as one of the great expressions of Andalusian sorrow. From Alhama, the Castilians pressed on. Ronda, that most spectacular of mountain fortress towns perched upon a great cliff, fell in 1485 after a siege in which artillery was used with devastating effect against walls that had been thought unassailable. Malaga, the great port city on the Mediterranean coast, fell in 1487 after a horrific siege in which the population held out against starvation for months and was punished when it finally surrendered with mass enslavement. Almeria followed. Baza followed. One by one, the great towns and cities of the emirate were taken, and the Nasrid kingdom shrank to a smaller and smaller patch of territory centered upon Granada itself. Within the walls of the capital, the divisions among the royal family made everything worse. The old emir Abu al-Hassan Ali had been overthrown by his own son Boabdil, who had then been captured by the Castilians in an ill-advised sally, and released only on the condition that he serve as a Castilian vassal against his own father. When his father was in turn overthrown by his uncle, called Al-Zaghal, the emirate was effectively split, with Boabdil holding Granada as a Castilian ally and Al-Zaghal holding the eastern territories in defiance. Ferdinand and Isabella exploited this division brilliantly, playing one Nasrid against another, treating Boabdil as their ally while methodically conquering the territories held by Al-Zaghal. And then, when Al-Zaghal was defeated and had submitted, turning at last upon Boabdil himself. By the year 1490, only the city of Granada and its immediate surroundings remained in Muslim hands. And Boabdil, who had helped the Christian monarchs so much on his path to the throne, now found himself the last emir of the last kingdom of Al-Andalus. In the spring of 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella laid siege to Granada in earnest. They did not attempt an assault, for the city was strong and its people were desperate, and they judged that the cost of storming it would be terrible. Instead, they built a whole town outside the walls to house their army through the coming winter, a town they called Santa Fe, Holy Faith, and from it they blockaded Granada and waited. The siege lasted through the summer and the autumn and into the winter, and within the city conditions grew steadily worse. Food ran short. Faction fights broke out. Some of the great families of the city, seeing that the end was near, began to slip out under cover of darkness and to negotiate their own terms with the Christian monarchs. And in the end, Boabdil, seeing that his people were suffering and that no rescue would come from anywhere, opened secret negotiations of surrender. The terms that were agreed to were, on paper, remarkably generous. Ferdinand and Isabella promised that the Muslims of Granada would keep their religion, their mosques, their laws, their language, and their property. They would not be forced to convert. They would not be expelled. They would have their own judges in matters that concerned only Muslims, and their taxes would be no greater than those they had paid to their own emirs. Christian and Muslim were to live side by side, each in their own faith, under the crown of Castile and Aragon. It was, in effect, a version of the old dhimmi arrangement in reverse, with the Muslims now the protected minority. Boabdil himself was to receive a small lordship in the mountains and a substantial payment of gold in exchange for the peaceful surrender of the city. The terms were signed in late November of 1491, with the actual handover to take place at the beginning of the new year. And so, on the 2nd of January in the year 1492, the great long story of Al-Andalus reached its close. Boabdil rode out of the Alhambra at the head of a small retinue and made his way down through the narrow streets of the city he had ruled to a plain outside the walls, where Ferdinand and Isabella waited on horseback with their court arrayed around them. He dismounted and offered the keys of the Alhambra to the Christian monarchs. There is some doubt about the exact ceremony that followed, whether the keys were handed over with kisses upon the hand or with some other formality, but the substance of the moment was clear. The last Muslim ruler in Iberia was surrendering the last Muslim kingdom to the Christian rulers who now claimed the whole peninsula for their crown. The banner of Castile was raised over the highest tower of the Alhambra. The bells of the churches, hastily consecrated from the mosques, began to ring across the city, and Al-Andalus, which had begun on a beach at Gibraltar in the year 711, ended upon a plain outside Granada in the year 1492, 781 years later. The most famous story of that day, though it is probably a legend added later by storytellers rather than a true recollection, is nonetheless too fitting to leave untold. It is said that Boabdil, riding away from the city with his mother and his small band of followers, stopped upon a pass in the mountains south of Granada to look back one last time at the city he had lost. And as he gazed at the red walls of the Alhambra glowing in the winter sun, he began to weep. His mother, watching him, is said to have spoken to him harshly, telling him not to cry like a woman for what he could not defend like a man. Whether she truly said such a thing or not, the place upon the pass has been known ever since as the Sigh of the Moor, El Suspiro del Moro, and it is one of the great melancholy sites of Spanish geography. From that pass, one still looks back at Granada, and it is easy, standing there, to imagine a young man on horseback pausing to weep for the palace of red walls and courtyards of fountains and calligraphy on white plaster that he would never see again. Ferdinand and Isabella entered Granada in triumph and took up residence in the Alhambra itself. They walked through the Court of the Lions, where the 12 marble beasts still held up their fountain, and through the Court of the Myrtles, where the still water still reflected the arches. They received the keys of the city, and they received the congratulations of ambassadors from every court in Europe, who marveled that the last stronghold of Islam in Western Europe had at last fallen. The Pope in Rome ordered special masses of thanksgiving to be sung. Church bells rang from Naples to Antwerp. For the Christian world, the completion of the Reconquest was one of the great triumphs of the age, and for Ferdinand and Isabella it was the crowning achievement of their reign. They took a new title to mark it. They became the Catholic monarchs, Los Reyes Católicos, so proclaimed by the grateful Pope, and they added the pomegranate, the emblem of Granada, to the royal arms of Castile. But the triumph of 1492 was not the end of the story of Muslim Spain in the way that the surrender treaty had promised. Within a decade, the terms of that treaty began to be violated, at first quietly and then more openly, and within a generation, the whole idea of a Muslim minority living freely under Christian rule in Spain would be abandoned. The change was driven partly by hardline churchmen who could not bear the thought of Islam surviving on Iberian soil, and partly by fears of political disloyalty, and partly by the growing insistence in the newly united Spain that religious uniformity was essential to national strength. Beginning in the late 1490s, pressure was applied to the Muslims of Granada to convert. When some resisted, riots broke out. When those riots were suppressed, the Crown declared that the treaty had been broken and issued edicts requiring conversion or exile. By 1502, the Muslims of Castile, including those of Granada, were faced with the same choice the Almohads had once forced upon the Christians and Jews. They could accept baptism, they could leave, or they could face terrible consequences. Most, having nowhere to go, accepted baptism, becoming the community known as the Moriscos, Christians on the outside, and in many cases, Muslims in secret at home. Their situation, always precarious, grew steadily worse over the following century. Their language was suppressed. Their customs were forbidden. Their marriages, their bathing, their music, their clothing were all made subjects of official concern and often of legal prohibition. Suspicion of secret Muslim practice hung over them constantly, and the Inquisition, that terrible tribunal established by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1478, watched them without rest. And in the year 1609, more than a century after the fall of Granada, the Crown at last decided that the Morisco problem could not be solved by any means short of expulsion. Between 1609 and 1614, some 300,000 Moriscos were forcibly deported from Spain, driven onto ships and sent across the sea to North Africa, where many, having lost their Arabic and their old customs over the generations, arrived as strangers in a strange land. Rest now, with the pass called the Sigh of the Moor looking back over Granada in the winter light, and a whole people preparing, without knowing it yet, for the long, slow shadow of exile that would follow the surrender. The same year that saw the fall of Granada saw two other events that, taken together, would reshape the world beyond any recognition. In March of 1492, only 3 months after Boabdil rode out of his palace weeping, Ferdinand and Isabella signed a decree ordering the expulsion of all Jews from their kingdoms. The Jewish communities of Spain, some of which traced their presence upon the peninsula back to Roman times, and which had produced under Muslim and Christian rulers alike some of the greatest scholars, poets, physicians, and philosophers of the medieval world, were given 4 months to convert to Christianity or to leave. Perhaps 150,000 chose to leave, scattering across the Mediterranean world, to Portugal, to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, where their descendants would preserve for centuries the language of medieval Spain, called Ladino, and the memory of the country from which they had been driven. The great multi-religious civilization that had existed in some form since the days of the Caliphate was, in a single year, brought to a formal end by the same monarchs who had entered the Alhambra in triumph. And then, in August of that same year, from the little port of Palos on the Atlantic coast of Andalusia, a Genoese sailor in the service of the Catholic monarchs set out with 3 small ships to seek a western route to the Indies. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he had spent years at the court of Ferdinand and Isabella waiting for their attention. Once Granada fell and the wars of the Reconquest were over, they finally had the leisure and the resources to fund his expedition. In October, he made landfall in the Caribbean, and the world entered an age none of the men on those ships could have foreseen. In a single calendar year, then, the Iberian Peninsula had ended its long entanglement with the Muslim world, expelled its ancient Jewish population, and launched the voyage that would open the Americas to European conquest. 3 doors closed and 1 opened, all within 12 months, and it is impossible to think about any of them in isolation from the others. The wealth of the New World would flow, in the following century, into the same Spain that had just cast out so much of the old. Yet the story of Al-Andalus does not truly end at Granada, any more than the story of the Norse ended at Stamford Bridge. What ends is only its political existence. What continues, and continues to this day, is its inheritance, and that inheritance is greater than most people realize. To ask what Al-Andalus left behind is to ask what the modern world owes to a civilization that no longer exists as a state, and the answer runs deeper than any single monument or single book. Consider first the physical inheritance, the buildings and the cities that still stand upon the Iberian earth. The great mosque of Cordoba survives, converted into a cathedral in the 13th century by simply inserting a Christian church in the middle of its forest of striped arches, so that today one can walk from the shadowy vastness of the old prayer hall into a soaring Renaissance nave and back again, all within a single roof. The Alhambra survives, cared for through the centuries, and now one of the most visited monuments in Europe. The Giralda Tower in Seville, once the minaret of the great mosque there, still rises above the city, its bells now Christian, but its brickwork still telling the old story. The Alcazars of Seville, of Segovia, of Malaga, the little synagogue in Toledo that was once a mosque before it was a synagogue and then became a church, the terraced gardens and the winding streets of the old quarters of dozens of Spanish cities. All of these are pieces of Al-Andalus still living within modern Spain. Even the very layout of towns, the way the streets bend and narrow and open suddenly onto small squares with a fountain in the middle, carries the imprint of the Andalusian past. Consider next the language. Modern Spanish contains, by the reckoning of linguists, perhaps 4,000 words drawn from Arabic, absorbed during the long centuries of coexistence. Some of them are names of foods that the Muslims brought to Iberia and that then spread to the wider world: rice and sugar and orange, spinach and artichoke and lemon. Some are names of buildings and their parts: alcove and mattress, admiral and arsenal and cotton, all carrying the old Arabic definite article al still visible at their beginnings. Some are technical terms of mathematics and science: algebra and algorithm, cipher and zero, that reveal how much of the scientific vocabulary of the modern world was first shaped in the schools of Cordoba and Toledo. And many are simply ordinary words that people use every day without any sense of their exotic origin. Every time a Spaniard says Ojala, from Wa Sha Allah, God willing, he speaks a word that came into his language from the mosque and the marketplace of medieval Al-Andalus. The Arabic layer runs deep in Spanish, and through Spanish it reached the whole of the Americas, so that today more than 500 million speakers scattered across 2 continents unknowingly carry pieces of the language of Al-Andalus in their mouths. Consider next the transmission of learning, which may be the most important legacy of all. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as the Christian kingdoms took city after city from the retreating Muslim power, they inherited not only the buildings but the libraries. Toledo, taken in 1085, became for 2 centuries afterward the great translation center of medieval Europe, where teams of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked together to render into Latin the vast philosophical, scientific, and medical literature that had accumulated in Arabic. Through this channel flowed into Europe the works of Aristotle, largely lost in the West since the fall of Rome, but preserved in Arabic translations made in Baghdad centuries earlier and now translated again into Latin. Through this channel came the medical writings of Galen and Hippocrates, along with the additions of great Arab physicians like Ibn Sina, known to the Latin world as Avicenna, and the great commentaries of Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes. Through this channel came Indian numerals, which the West would come to call Arabic numerals, and with them the concept of zero and the whole apparatus of decimal calculation that made modern arithmetic possible. Through this channel came new star tables and astronomical instruments, new techniques of surgery and pharmacy, new mathematical methods that would in time make possible everything from the calendar reforms of the 16th century to the physics of the 17th. When the universities of Paris and Oxford and Bologna began in the 12th and 13th centuries to study the newly translated Aristotle and Averroes, they set in motion the intellectual revolution that would eventually flower into the Renaissance, and through the Renaissance, into the science and philosophy of the modern world. The road from Al-Andalus to the modern West runs, in large part, through those translation workshops of Toledo, where the books that had been gathered by the caliphs of Cordoba passed at last into the Latin tongue. Consider also the practical arts. The Andalusians knew how to irrigate dry land with a sophistication that transformed the agriculture of every region they touched, and they left behind in Spain a system of water rights and water courts, the Tribunal de las Aguas of Valencia, which still meets every Thursday in the same place it has met for 1,000 years, judging disputes over the distribution of water among farmers. In the same manner it did under Muslim rule. They knew the working of silk and the tanning of leather and the making of paper, that most transformative of technologies, which had come from China through the Islamic world and reached Europe first through Al-Andalus. The first paper mill in Europe was in Muslim Zatava, and from there paper making spread northward to change forever the possibilities of writing and reading and the storage of knowledge. Music, too, was shaped in Al-Andalus in ways that reached deep into European tradition. The lute took its name from the Arabic al-aud, the very forms of medieval Iberian song and poetry, which passed north into Provence in the 11th century and gave rise there to the troubadour tradition, appear in some measure to owe their inspiration to Andalusian models of love poetry and courtly song. When a modern flamenco guitarist bends a note in a way that seems to come from farther east than the west of Spain, he is drawing, however distantly, upon a musical inheritance that runs back through Granada and Cordoba to the courts of the caliphs. And consider at last the harder inheritance, the one that cuts across all the others, and that must be honestly named. Al-Andalus was not a paradise, though later ages have sometimes wished to remember it as one. It was a civilization built on conquest, sustained in part by slavery, marked by periods of religious tolerance and periods of religious persecution, always liable to fall into faction and civil war, and finally destroyed as much by its own internal divisions as by external enemies. Its Christian and Jewish subjects lived under real restrictions, sometimes gentle, sometimes brutal, and its Muslim rulers were capable of great generosity and great cruelty in almost equal measure. The famous conviventure, the coexistence of the three faiths, was real but was also always fragile, and it broke down repeatedly in ways that produced great suffering. To romanticize Al-Andalus is to do it a kind of disservice, for it papers over the human complexity of what actually happened there. And yet, when all the qualifications are made, there remains this simple fact. For nearly 800 years, on a peninsula at the western edge of the Old World, three religious communities lived side by side in a shared culture, producing together a civilization of remarkable achievement, and this fact is worth remembering, precisely because it is so rare in human history. Whatever Al-Andalus was, it was not a fairy tale, but neither was it nothing. It was a real thing, and it left real seeds, and those seeds grew. The great story that began with a small Berber army landing on a beach beneath a limestone rock has run its long course. Its ships came and went, its caliphs rose and fell, its cities burned and were rebuilt, its scholars translated and its poets sang, its palaces were raised in glory and left in ruin. Its people did not disappear so much as dissolve into everyone who came after, so that the modern peoples of Spain and Portugal, the modern Sephardic Jewish communities of the Mediterranean and the Americas, the modern Muslim populations descended from those who fled to North Africa, and through all of these, the wider modern world, all carry within them, whether they know it or not, some quiet portion of the Andalusian inheritance. The state ended in 1492. The civilization has never really ended, because it flowed onward into what came next, hidden inside the languages and the buildings and the ideas of the world it had helped to make. Well, if you are somehow still awake after all of that, I am glad you stayed with me to the end. There is another story waiting for you on the screen right now, if you would like to keep drifting along together a little longer. And if you enjoyed this quiet journey through the long age of Al-Andalus, it would mean a great deal if you would take a slow moment to like and subscribe, or leave a passing thought down in the comments before you go. But there is nothing left for you to do now but rest. Let your body grow heavy and still. Let your breathing settle. Let the fountains of the Alhambra keep playing softly in the back of your mind, and let the last small kingdom of Al-Andalus fade gently into the winter light. Close your eyes and go to sleep. Sweet dreams.